I do. Sorry. Okay. I have to do a little fiddle with my thing. There we go. Hello. I hope George didn't say anything too embarrassing. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. It's a real thrill for me, and had so many friends here as well. It's a sense of coming home, and George and I both did a talk here some years ago on this subject. This is a continuing fascination of mine. I think everything's a journey. I'll explain that how people come to form their attitudes on climate change is a personal journey. We all have journeys. We have journeys in which things come to us with sudden changes in our views and moments of awareness and revelation. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And really, for me, the fascinating question increasingly has been this one: Why is our response so, not just weird, so very weird, so peculiar? We have become habituated to a response and understanding of climate change which is absolutely extraordinary. Why is that? Let me tell a little bit of this journey. Some years ago, I got this copy of the Independent. This is. Maybe you remember when newspapers used to cover front page stories about climate change like this. This is a 3-page special in the Independent, touching the void, how climate change is destroying the world's most spectacular landscapes. Page 3, as it steadily melts, the whole infrastructure of alpine tourism is at risk. It said we had 50 years left of the skiing industry before it collapsed. This is the Saturday edition of the Independent. So you can imagine it has all of these different parts and supplements, inside of which was the travel supplement. The travel supplement, hang on, 50, I like this 50. You could do one a year, and if you pace it, probably the last one, you're not quite going to be on the gravel. But let's deconstruct this for a moment. Every single one of these best ski resorts requires a long-distance, long-haul flight in order to get to them. There is an internal contradiction there, an internal moral imbalance, which is, I have to say, extremely weird, extremely strange. But at the same time that the newspaper is warning of the destruction of something, it is openly advocating that you pursue the act which leads to that very destruction. In fact, it almost justifies the fact that you should contribute to the destruction of something that you love because it is being destroyed by the very actions that are required for you to go and pursue it. I have to say, I think this is very peculiar. We do not expect these contradictions in any other domain. We do not expect the Guardian to carry articles on the best handguns, or the Daily Telegraph to have a pull-out supplement on how to defraud benefit, or any of these things where we know that there's a very strong position, a political position, but it's internally contradicted. These contradictions appear the whole way through climate change. One of the things which happens with this, and we can see this a little bit with the area of skiing, is that people can separate their own behavior in one regards from their behavior in another. There's one of the things I discovered when I was reading the book was the whole background of theory around moral licensing. Moral license by which people create narratives of their own virtue, their own goodness, as a form of immunity to inoculate themselves against some other behavior which is challenging to that. The obvious one, you see this the whole time, is say in a fast food restaurant where someone will get the double bacon cheeseburger and then they'll get the super-sized Diet Coke to go with it. And this has been I'm not being facetious, this has been well studied as a form of moral license. It's a theme I'll touch on tonight. But moral licensing extends also to this issue of our behaviors. This, for example, this is a classic case. This is, believe it or not, this is a campaign that Tesco's ran, where you could be rewarded for switching over to low-energy light bulbs with air miles. You could feel good in every. Has there ever been a more blatant form of direct moral licensing? Feel good about your lights. Feel good about your flights. It's all win-win-win in Tesco world. Again, why is this is peculiar? Let's face it, this is extremely strange. Here's another one, by the way. I collect these. If you have any, send them to me. This isn't moral license, but this is the juxtaposition which occurs the whole way through between an issue that we know is extremely serious and the facetious undermining of it. But these things sit alongside each other, because for every conversation we have on climate change, for every article in a newspaper on climate change, there is an adjacent article which actively undermines it. And this, again, as I said, is peculiar. It requires some explanation. This is from a newsagent close to me. Here we can see how we are bombarded with information from all sides promoting high-carbon lifestyles which contribute directly to climate change. And these pieces of information here nestling around the one piece which might tell us what the consequences are. So we're used to this strange world in which we're actively encouraged to do something whilst at the same time being warned of what the consequences of that action are. Psychologically, we're in linguistic theory, Irving Goffman, in terms of psychological theory, you could say about creating frames around things, frames which allow you to focus in both on what you pay attention to, but also what to cut out of a picture. There is the frame. Inside the frame is what you have decided to focus on, what you've decided to pay attention to. And if you are drawn towards these kinds of high-carbon lifestyles, let's face it, it's probably going to be parched planet which gets blocked out. That's what you see on the magazine racks. So what's interesting, of course, is you do see the parched planet. It's not like you ignore that, but you can block it out. And similarly, maybe for many of us, when we see that, we're focusing in on this. I think it's this competing battle between attention and disattention, which is one of these key themes for climate change as I've explored it. How our brains are able to focus in on some things and disregard others. It is part of our fundamental functioning, how we keep sane in this information-saturated world, that we have the skills to select what we look at, the skills to keep things in separate compartments, to be able to focus in on one thing and to disregard others. I mean, originally, psychology was most interested, and I say this, I should explain, I'm not trained in psychology, I'm coming to this as an outsider. But psychology focused on the process of attention. What were the things which gave something attention, that gave it salience, that brought it to the fore? And clearly, as I'll argue tonight, climate change has problems with that. It is weak in the very areas which demand our attention. But also, what are the qualities which make us disregard things, being able to put them on one side and ignore them? And again, unfortunately, climate change appears in some ways to work quite strongly to that. There's this balance between attention and disattention. Climate change seems to lose on both scores. And, okay, I mean, we could talk all evening about it. Is it weird? Does it matter? Does it matter? Okay, it's a bit funny and it's a bit messy, but it's like, well, you know, the Independent is still having 3 pages on climate change, even if it's undermining it and so on. Yes, of course, it does matter. First of all, I'm not going to talk about climate change. It's one of the pledges in my book. In fact, I wanted a sticker on the front saying guaranteed graph-free. You know, nothing on climate change, because how could you talk about how we ignore climate change by starting off the book by talking about how serious climate change is? Because, of course, then you're triggering all of the very processes that people try and pull away from. But climate change is extremely serious, and this is why this is so extremely bizarre. This is a monumental threat. This is, without question, the greatest collective threat we have ever faced as a species on this planet. I'm not even going to explain why, it is. What I do in the book, though, is I don't even talk in detail about it, but I talk about how climate scientists and people who follow this issue are coming to terms with their growing conviction that we're facing a 4-degree world, and what that 4 degrees will mean. And it is absolutely catastrophic. And the world's leading climate scientists find it hard to put this into words other than to say that they cannot see how, in the words of John Schellnhuber from Potsdam Institute, we cannot see how it is possible to maintain an advanced civilization of the kind we have now under conditions of 4 degrees. Basically, we're talking about collapse. We're talking about it very close. Royal Society was saying that we could be getting this certainly by the 2080s, maybe even earlier, maybe in the 2070s. Not that far away. So does it matter? Yes, this really matters. And if we're not responding to this in a rational and balanced way, we'd better work out how we are responding to it and why we're responding the way we do. Because all of the scientific predictions, the IPCC predictions about where we're going to be going over the next few years, are basically built on assumptions about how we will respond in terms of our collective response and our psychology. The scenarios are all based on assumptions of our response. And if we're responding in bizarre ways, in ways which are not rational in any form, there are many, many other scenarios out there, including scenarios that are deeply disturbing, scenarios of completely aberrant denial, scenarios under which, in order to cope with this thing over here that we can't deal with, we go and do something completely bizarre in another area. And we know especially from the disgusting and poisoned history of the last century, how people under conditions of stress and anxiety can respond in ways that bear no relation to a real issue they're dealing with, but about, for example, scapegoating another group, declaring wars, horrific human rights abuses. There's a lot of nasty scenarios there, and we better really get to the bottom of what's going on. Okay, so what's going on? Well, I've had the privilege, writing the book, of going and speaking to some of the world's experts. It's been a wonderful experience and a journey to go to people and say, you tell me what you think is going on. And what I've tried to do in the book is to piece together their findings as best as I can. One of these is that we know that built within the very architecture of the brain are different ways of processing information. It suggests here that these are hemispheric, but actually that's misleading. It's more complex than that. We know, though, that there is what we can say, there's a number of different terms for this. We'll stick at the moment with the analytic reasoning. It deals with numbers, data, symbols and logic. It deals with the core stuff of science, basically. This is a critical side. This is our advanced cognition, which is necessary for us to build the modern world. This is what makes us humans. This is what makes us the stupendously smart beings that we are. But ultimately, what drives us, what makes us take action, what moves us forward, is the affective reasoning. It is this deeper, more historical brain, which is the response which underlies the rational. So there's a conversation which is happening constantly between these two sides. This side is much more related to the things which are urgent and immediate, here and now, proximity, the things we've experienced, drawing on our immediate direct experience. The social values and the social cues. We're constantly reading and scanning the people around us for them to tell us what we should pay attention to or what we should disattend. These cues, this is what's important, I need to follow this. We do this all of the time, mostly subconsciously. Metaphor. Metaphor is another form of experience. This thing looks like this other thing I already know about. Our brains, given a choice between two things which are close, will shift to default. They'll shift to the one that seems familiar to them already. We think metaphorically in lots of ways. Metaphor isn't just about language. Metaphor is also about experience, I'll say later. And above all, the language of this side, the affective side, is the language of stories. This side is dealing with data. This side is dealing with stories. Now we can see we have a challenge here already with climate change, which is so strongly based in the science. It's coming in on this side here. The assumption for a long time for science communicators has been that this in itself will mobilize us to take action. But if we can simply find a way of converting the science into forms that people can grasp, that it will move them. Of course, their assumptions on that are themselves from social values, that the values of science are based in the values of this language over here. But it is clear that is not the case. It is clear that over the past 20 years, the evidence of climate change has built and built and built and built, and yet we seem to be no closer to dealing with that. The levels of risk become ever more serious, and yet we seem to be unable to accept it or cope with it because we are locked over on this side. We have a disconnection between the information and the stories that we're telling ourselves about it with the social cues. We have a problem, of course, with the proximity. We have a problem, too, with the fundamental issues here, with climate change. Ebola, for example, which is all over in the newspapers. It is here, it is now. It is immediate. There is a visible threat. It is fundamentally terrifying. Climate change in many ways does not have those qualities. It seems distant, remote, intangible. This is something very, very real. You know, 2 months ago, when was it? It was, actually no, just scarcely 6 weeks ago. Barack Obama was standing in front of the United Nations. He said, we face many, many challenges and threats at the moment. And he said specifically, we face ISIS, we face Islamic threats, we face terrorist threats. He says, but climate change, this is the biggest threat of all. It is this threat which is outlining the contours of this coming century. And brave words. I agree. I mean, you cannot look at the risk of climate change and not come to that conclusion. But of course, the contours is something on the far distant hill. It's something over there. And our brains are focused on the threat around the next bend in the road, in particular, the personal threats. And that is why we're seeing this. I'm collecting these. These are appearing these kinds of cartoons are appearing the whole way through the conservative press in America, mocking people, in this case, Hillary Clinton, saying that climate change is a major threat against the real salient threat. Talk about a denial of the enemy, the visible enemy. And I'm going to come back to this point. So climate change has these problems in terms of speaking to that affective side of our brain. It does not appear to be here. It does not appear to be now. It does not have these clear enemies with intention to cause us harm. One of the thrills of writing the book was a chance to meet people that I just love to meet. And on my hero list is Professor Daniel Kahneman. A very nice man, very, very generous, and he gave very generously of his time to talk me through about this, saying to me that he was apologizing for the fact that he really didn't know much about climate change. Well, of course he knew a great deal about it. And of course I was most interested in talking to people who didn't work professionally on climate change. Because Kahneman might not work on climate change, but he is one of the leading thinkers of our time. And for anybody who has read his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, that's immediately apparent. He won a Nobel Prize on very strong grounds, because he is the founder of an entire school of theory, of strong evidence-based research into the way that our biases distort things. That our thinking is fundamentally biased because of the structure of the brain which he describes as system 1, system 2, to veer us away from rational thinking processes. And he's discovered dozens and dozens of biases. But there's 3 or 4 which really concern him when it comes to climate change. First of all, it's not here and now, it's in the future, as Professor Kahneman would say. That's a problem. So we have a tendency to, what he would say, to discount the future. What happens tomorrow is much less important. What happens tomorrow is much more important than what happens in 2 days' time. What happens in 2 days' time is much more important to us than what happens in a week. And once you get beyond a certain point, to be honest, there isn't a huge difference between 10 years and 20 years. But it's already so far away. But we're capable of postponing action. We can say we'll do anything. We're facing this at the moment with enormous discounting in climate change policy. That, sure, we're going to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. But we'll probably start doing that around 2030. Because the fact is we're prepared to take on any amount of sacrifice when it's sufficiently far away in the future. We can keep it just pushed over the horizon. He also says we're very loss averse. And his research shows this very strongly in what he said to me, the domain of losses. Climate change is in the domain of losses. That is to say, it is about whether you make a loss now in order to avert a greater loss in the future. When economists like Sir Nicholas Stern express climate change in terms of, well, we will lose so much of our GDP now, but look how much more we stand to lose in the future, he is unfortunately, unwittingly, exactly reproducing the kind of experiments that Daniel Kahneman shows that we do not respond to. But we will willingly take a gamble on stuff on the future. Because you know what? We might be hit by that mythical bus which keeps going round and round and round, knocking people over who smoke 40 cigarettes a day. Because that anything could happen. So we will take the gamble on the future. And all kinds of appeals like, oh my God, what about future generations? What about your children? Will not work. It's interesting, incidentally, as an aside, and one of the things I mentioned in the book, that whilst if we are passionate about climate change, we might believe that people with children share that passion, or that people with children will be very concerned about the world they're bringing children into. Across a population as a whole, people with children are somewhat, if anything, less inclined to be concerned about climate change or talk about it than people without children. People who are concerned about climate change if they have children are very concerned about their children's welfare. People who are not concerned apparently disregard their children's welfare. There's no universal law that says that being concerned about children has to make you take action on climate change at all. People apply their concern to the conclusions they've already reached. Professor Kahneman also said that uncertainty was the third consideration. That when there is uncertainty, we tend not to be drawn towards firm conclusions. We tend to step outside and just say, well, let's just wait and see. In his words to me, he said, actually, my research tells me this is the worst possible kind of problem. It combines all of the things that we are lousy at. He was very nice about it. He's very apologetic. He said, I'm so sorry. But I think he was being sorry not just to me, but to his grandchildren, the whole world. It's like, I'm so sorry, but I really see no hope on this. Well, I just thought I'd share that with you. But, you know, is it... I was thinking about this, is it really the perfect problem? You know, I have to say, I smell a rat. Because is climate change really in the future? Because it seems to me that there's some extremely severe things happening in the weather now. In fact, you could say that climate change has been well underway for at least 50 years, maybe longer. Is it in the future? Well, only if we choose to put it in the future. Is it uncertain? Well, only if we define it in terms of being uncertain. That's to say, we choose to say that the jury is still out. Is it expensive? This is Kahneman's other concern, but it's the domain of losses. Well, yes, we could say it's expensive, but there's plenty of very strong evidence to say that there's some economic benefits that can come from it as well. And there's certainly other social benefits that can come from dealing with climate change, as Naomi Klein was saying for us the other week. So in other words, the fact that it's a perfect problem is in itself part of a story that we have chosen to tell about it. In other words, we are very, very, very clever. What we do is that we know ourselves so well that we set climate change up so it will fail against the very qualities that we know that we're bad at. Right? We have biases which make us hard to deal with certain things, and so we define it in terms of those biases. Here's an example of how we do that. This is a survey from Yale, and I'm just going to take you... Oh, sorry, did I say graph free? This is the only one. The question is this: who will be harmed by global warming? And let's just look at it will harm a great deal. In America, 10% of people think that climate change will harm them personally a lot. 11% thinks it will harm their family a lot. Really? 13% their community, 21% people in the US as a whole. Sorry, doesn't that include that? 22% people in other industrialized nations, 31% people in developing countries. You see there's a pattern forming here. 44% future generations, 45% plants and animal species. This progression, and which incidentally is found in a whole lot of surveys, including surveys in Britain, is so gradual and so automatic that it seems pretty clear to me that what is happening here is that people are defining the probability of climate change as being greater and more harmful the further away from them it is. In other words, they're choosing to define climate change in terms of its distance. There was a survey a few years back in Britain. 87% of people said that climate change will have a major impact on future generations. That's more than the total number of people who believe that climate change is even a problem at all. There are people out there who are answering this survey that climate change is a major threat for future generations who do not believe that climate change is a major threat. In other words, is it an impossible problem? Yes, it is, if you define it as a problem in those terms. You define it as something which is a major threat in the future. And I fear this is what we've been doing for the last 20 years. We've been keeping this thing at arm's length. It's always just over the horizon. It's always a problem in the future. Current surveys at the moment show the vast majority of people regard climate change as a major threat in the future. So, to come to the sort of conclusion. The conclusion I came to was that climate change Because the affective side of our brain requires stories, it exists for us primarily as constructed narratives. Narratives that we build in terms of our values, our worldview, our personal life experience. And that therefore, it does not exist for us in the terms of scientific facts, however much we might make it that. It exists for us as social facts, as stories which become picked up and conveyed one to another, we shape and form both in terms of our own interests and also collectively amongst us. So it is challenging. I mean, amongst the people I spoke to were psychotherapists who say, look, actually what we're seeing is people are trying to detach themselves away from this. It's causing them anxiety. And there's no question about that. This is immensely challenging, this issue. So one of the things we do is that we're generating storylines that allow us to cope with it, allow us to ignore it or to reject it. Or that what we do is we shape the thing in our own image. We turn it into something that makes sense in terms of us and our values and who we say we are. So, let's watch people talking about climate change. This is fascinating. This is something we do a lot of in COIN, where we run focus groups and we go and talk to people. And this is something where people in the street, in Dublin as it happens, were invited to come and sit on a bar stool. So they put the bar stool out in the street. They say, come and sit on the bar stool and tell us what you think about climate change. The idea being that a bar stool is a place where you love to, I don't know, maybe it happens in Irish pubs that people talk about climate change in the pub. But you sit there and you share your views and your ideas of the world. Now just watch how each of these stories ratchet up.
Are you familiar with the term climate change?
I am indeed, my friend. And I haven't believed that I know what it's about.
Global warming, emissions, pollution, recycling, all that kind of thing.
It could be warming, cooling, more rain, more drought.
Floods, having a tan, penguins, and like melting icebergs.
The first thing I think of is polar bears, and then after that I think that probably I should think about it more, but there's so much going on that I don't really think about it at all, to be honest.
The end of the world.
I think so, but then there's a lot of people who say that it's not real and that it's just made up.
The lobby to try and tell us that there is no climate change is very powerful, and even though there's a lot of consensus, there's still so much of the media is saturated by people saying that it doesn't exist, and they have a lot more money than the people who don't.
There's too much money getting made. It's as simple as that, and they don't want, they're greedy. Oh, they don't want to lose their money.
There's no doubt that 97% of the evidence out there is supported by scientists that this change is happening.
I definitely think everyone in the world is going to be affected by climate change one way or another, whether they like it or not.
Now, I find that kind of thing fascinating, and I've watched this. I've shown this quite a few times. I watch it with fresh eyes every time. What I'd say is, life's an experiment. I mean, every conversation you have with someone about climate change is a kind of experiment in just seeing how people respond, how they're making sense of it, the kind of responses they give you back. So look at all the different ways there that the people are constructing these little stories around it, or the way that they're thinking and talking about it, and the way that is all based in their own worldview. Look at these polar bears. Where do these polar bears come from? There's something which have been created as a model for it. You know, most people have no relationship with polar bears. In the book, I say this is a disaster. That polar bears are a very good example of how environmentalists, when they took control of this issue, and we did, I am an environmentalist, we took hold of this issue in the 1980s. We have maintained a very strong hold over it, and we have projected our own values and images and concerns and iconography onto it. And one of the consequences of that is polar bears. I know when I worked in Greenpeace, we were talking about saving. I was the head of forest campaigns for Greenpeace US, and we were talking about fighting for the western seaboard of Canadian temperate rainforest and up the Canadian coast. We said, what should we call it? And then someone said, How about a bear? Is there a bear up there? Could we name it after a bear? And then someone said, I know, let's call it the Great Bear Rainforest. Yeah, Great Bear. And so we've stuck a bear on because we like having bears on things. And you know, I still say to people, I think that bears are a disastrous symbol for climate change. They're distant, they're unconnected to people. They're all of the things which are about us creating distance. Distant in geography, distance in personal experience, all of the things which make it very hard for us to connect with it. People say, oh no, but when I put out the polar bear leaflets on my table, people love it, they all pick it up. I go, well, yeah, the polar bear people pick up the polar bear leaflets. You know, then you realize all of these things, you're just constantly reinforcing the same process. You say the same things, and the same people come to your events talking about the same language, and you think somehow you've got it right. The reality is that the majority of people are more likely, to be honest, to have seen an activist in a polar bear costume than to have seen a real polar bear in the wild. Activists are more likely to have been inside a polar bear costume than to have seen a polar bear in the wild. But let's hold on to polar bears for a moment. Polar bears are a tan, okay? There's something interesting. There's that kind of contradiction we saw earlier on. But some of the other reactions are also very peculiar too. How about the one with pause? It's the end of the world. Laugh. What is that? That's what I mean about how, I don't know, I can't say I have the answers, but there's something very, very peculiar about climate change in the way that people think and talk about it. You know? I don't know if people are being asked about, would people say, yeah, it's waterboarding. I don't know, or I'm trying to think here of what would be nasty issues that people would respond inappropriately to. But there's that thing too where everybody has a view which seems to correlate with exactly what we could predict. If we saw the pictures of them and we knew who they were and we said, who said this, we'd be able to tally very closely, wouldn't we? So we would say, these are the anti-establishment looking people. These are people who look like they're on the fringe of society. Not surprisingly, they're the people who say that it's all about power or the distortion of power. Then we have the respectable looking gentleman. The older one who says, well, 97% of the world's scientists say that climate change is a serious threat. What's that? It's another story. It's based in evidence, of a kind. There's plenty of ways one could even challenge that 97% figure. But it's a story. It's something he's picked up because he shares and holds those values. So a lot of what we have in climate change is these competing stories that we shape and form around us and our values, and then it just simply, they get passed around. Now these stories can take on a life of their own, and some of the stories which are going around at the moment, especially amongst people of conservative politics, are not based in truth at all, but they have a validity that simply comes from that point I was saying, the social cues. People like you, who are around you, are sharing these things and passing them around, and they seem, therefore, to take on a truth. But these are the stories we hear. And all of those we saw are very familiar. I'm much more interested in the stories we don't hear. Because the fascinating thing, and one of the weirdest things about climate change, is that actually, the vast majority of people never talk about it at all. I have a friend, Mayor Hillman, and some of you might know Mayor. He actually came and spoke for COIN in the early years. He wrote a very good book called Saving the Planet. And Mayor, I always tell this story because I think it's so good. Mayor's very passionate about climate change. He said, "We've got to take climate change seriously. This is so important." Anyway, he got let out for the evening, and he went and had a dinner party with some friends, and they're all sitting around, and these are professional people. They're well off, professional retired people, and they're all talking about where they've gone for their holidays. Well, someone had gone over here, they'd had their weekend break. Someone had just flown to Australia to visit their family, and Mayor's kind of like sitting there and fuming, and he can take just about as much of this as he can stand, and he finally blows his top. Because he cares passionately about this. He's somebody who's absolutely convinced. And he says, how can you be talking about this stuff? Don't you realize what flying does to the world? Don't you realize what you're doing to your grandchildren's future by behaving like this? And the dinner party goes completely quiet. And then someone says, my word, what a delightful spinach tart. Oh, did you pick the spinach yourself? How lovely. Is it yours? Is it organic? You must give me the recipe. The pastry's so flaky. Mayor says they spoke for 10 minutes about the spinach tart. Then they moved on. They'd sanitized the subject that he had brought into a room like the Mask of Red Death in that Edgar Allan Poe story. He'd come in with this premonition of the future, and they had just dropped it. And as any of you will know, this is a very common phenomenon. If you try and raise climate change, people don't want to talk about it. A couple of ladies on the train yesterday. On the train, I try and confront this every chance I have, and I hope you do the same. Every day, I try and talk about climate change with a complete stranger. Okay, well, try it. Try it and report back to me what happens. I do this partly on the basis of the fact that a third of people cannot recall ever having had a conversation in their entire lives about climate change with anyone. A third of people. That, to my mind, is staggering. So I just do it all the time. They're sitting there reading the Daily Mail. That's not a good sign. They're reading the Daily Mail and they say, yes, the weather's been really, really strange, hasn't it, dear? It's been really strange. It's like one of these tables where you sit opposite each other on the train and we try and avoid eye contact. I said, yes, you know what? I think that's because of climate change. They go, yes, the weather's been so strange, hasn't it? Yes, everything's been coming out at the wrong time of year. Yes. And then they just completely cut me out, like nobody is going to go there. So, climate change has a climate silence. In the book, I interviewed a man who is the expert in the world on socially constructed silence, a man called Eviata Zerubbabel. Another, like Daniel Kahneman, someone who'd never really thought much about climate change. He says in every way that climate change has the manifestations of a socially constructed silence. That is not to say that people do not talk about climate change, it's that people have a silence, a non-narrative about climate change. I said, Eviata, tell me, how do you study something that's not there? I mean, I can see how you can say know that people aren't talking about it, but how do you study a constructed silence? And he says, because there is a meta-silence. He says above the silence there is people cannot explain why they do not talk about it, they simply know that they don't. And that is very much the case with climate change. If I go out into the street now and I say to people, are you concerned about climate change? The majority of people will say absolutely. They will. Many of them will be able to tell me a great deal about it and why it's a serious problem and a major threat. If, however, I go out into the street and I say, can you tell me the 5 most serious things which are facing our world at the moment? I can guarantee that virtually none of them will mention climate change. That's the meta-silence. It is the thing that removes it from the public realm. And then if I'd say, how about climate change? They go, oh yes, climate change, that's a major problem, that's a huge concern. In other words, it's almost, and you see this again and again in focus groups, it's like if you prick the bubble, if you talk about it, it suddenly opens up. That's why so much of the research saying all of these people care about climate change is suspect, because they're primed with climate change. If you ask people, are you concerned about climate change, people know the response is yes. However, the politicians also know that if they go around the country and they run focus groups on what should be in the party manifesto, unless we make a difference and we go out there and make it happen, the vast majority of people do not mention climate change at all. What I did not anticipate, I knew this of course, but what I did not anticipate was that even in areas with extreme weather impacts, people did not appear to be talking about climate change. That's me. Hi Mum, that's me there in New Jersey. In New Jersey, as you can see, these houses have been smashed apart. This is very peculiar. It's like walking around a set for a zombie film. Block upon block upon block of buildings, completely blacked out. The only lights that they have there are produced by generators in order to keep, vandals away. In fact, shortly after this, a police car came hurtling around the corner, demanding to know what I was doing in the middle there. As you can see, the buildings are absolutely destroyed, all up and down the New Jersey seashore when I went there. 5 months after Hurricane Sandy, everything boarded up, destroyed. And I said to people in a whole series of interviews there, tell me about the last conversation you had on climate change. Nobody could tell me about one. They could tell me about how great their community was, how everyone had come together, how strong they were, how they were rebuilding. No one was talking about climate change. Of course, once I talked about climate change, they say, yes, we think this might be climate change. But they weren't talking about it. I did something similar in Texas. I went to Bastrop in Texas. Bastrop was a town where a third of a town had been burnt down in the worst wildfires in Texan history by a huge order of magnitude. I said, could you tell me the last time you had a conversation about climate change? Nobody had had that conversation. And yes, sure, this was Republican Texas, but there were plenty of people there who thought climate change might have something to do with it. The editor of a local newspaper, I said, can you tell me why you haven't talked about climate change? I mean, you had the worst wildfires in Texan history, following the worst drought in Texan history. Even your state climatologist, and you better believe he's in a tricky position in Texas, but even he says that there's a connection with climate change. She said, oh, we would cover it if it was relevant to Bastrop County, but we're just a local newspaper covering local issues. I said, well, forgive me, maybe I'm being naive, but my impression was that the media weren't usually that careful about, scientific certainty. I mean, you like to have a little bit of debate in your newspapers. No, they're not covering it. One lady I met in New Jersey was the mayor of Seabright. Seabright was a town where 3/4 of the businesses were still closed there when I was there. The whole Main Street was locked up. A lady called Dinah Long. Dinah's great. This is Dinah. She likes stories. And this is the story that she has. But she went to Donovan's Bar. Donovan's Bar was where everybody used to hang out down on the beach, down there in Seabright. After Hurricane Sandy came through, the whole thing had been smashed to pieces, and all she could find amongst the rubble was the first 2 letters of a sign that used to hang over the door. The Do of Donovan's. And here she is rallying the troops with this. I mean, as soon as I started speaking, of course you can imagine she's done this interview so many times, she brings this thing off the shelf and she starts waving it about like she's here. Do. We can do it. We can rebuild our community. We can make it strong again. We can bring in the investment that'll make things, that'll bring everything back. There she is with her Do. And this becomes the slogan of Seabright Rising. It's on all their t-shirts. It's all over the town. I said, Dinah, wow, you're a great leader. This is fantastic. I said, how about those leadership qualities? How about you and the other mayors of New Jersey? How about you go to Washington and you have a press conference and you say, we're on the front line of climate change. We demand action because we have seen climate change. She said, are you crazy? I said, no, I'm a little, I'm just trying to get you fired up, like we need strong leadership. She said, there's no way I'm going to do that. She said, I'm trying to build this story of positive reconstruction in my community. You want me to go there and start telling people that this thing could happen again? But there's another disaster, but this is just the beginning of it? It's like, there's no way. She said, duh. She said, duh, of course climate change is happening. She said, climate change may very well have been a factor in Hurricane Sandy. But she said, you know what? We'll deal with all that lofty stuff some other day. Can I disagree with her? No. She's a good leader. She's doing the right thing that she should do. But this, again, is another example of how there is the conversation about climate change, the narratives we have, and then there is the non-conversation, the whole way that this area gets removed from the public discourse. But it is not appropriate to talk about it. And if it is not appropriate to talk about it in places that have just been hit by extreme weather events, and if it is not appropriate to talk about it in places that are completely fine, because why would you want to talk about it? So, what's left? And how? In an area where, as I said, our fundamental belief and acceptance exists in the form of socially constructed narratives, can we have a collective determination to take action on something where we're not talking about it and there is no socially constructed or shared narrative? And that, I'm afraid, is the situation that we're in. We cannot get our heads around this issue until we start talking about it in our own terms and values, and we're simply not doing that. So people who try to make sense of this, to try and move us forward, are struggling with this issue of, do we need some form of enemy? And I want to touch on this. You remember like I was showing how powerfully motivated people could be around State of Islam. How powerful people could be motivated around terrorism. People who say climate change is so uncertain that we can't do anything about it are often the very same people who are saying we need to spend unlimited amounts of money defending ourselves and our countries and our way of life against the utter uncertainty of terrorism attacks. But somehow the uncertainty of terrorism makes it more dangerous, but the uncertainty of climate change makes it less dangerous. The difference between the two factors, of course, is the presence or the absence of an enemy. I mean, take this for example, right? Imagine our drone planes flying over Korea as it happens. There we go. And we see this. This is irrefutable proof, ladies and gentlemen. I wrote a piece on this in The Guardian, you can see. I was hoping it would start something viral. North Korea is poisoning the atmosphere. Irrefutable proof that in North Korea they're pumping gases into the atmosphere that they know will destroy the world's climate systems. In fact, tunneling under the border with a document signed specifically by Kim Jong-un himself. We have the proof there that they're doing this with the sole intention of destroying American grain production across the Midwest. There they are. Pumping the gases into the atmosphere. If that's what climate change was, if climate change was caused by North Korea with the intention of destroying grain production, we know it would be a very straightforward issue. There would be no lack of conversation. There would be no problem of bringing left and right together. There would be no political polarization on it. There would be no marches saying we need action. In fact, the only marches would be to say we need faster action and more of it. Because it would be a differently constructed problem. And this raises interesting questions about, is the big problem of climate change the one of the enemy? And I think it is. The issue with North Korea, or that North Korean example, what makes it powerful is two components. Both that there was an enemy, and a known enemy, someone we already know, but there was the intention to cause harm. This idea that somebody is doing something because they want to do it. For my holiday reading, I read this fascinating book by Gita Sereni, Into That Darkness. Strongly recommend it. This fellow here was talking on his past experiences, training at police school in Vienna in the 1920s. He's a former policeman, former Austrian policeman. And he says a crime to be a crime, this is what he learnt in police academy, must meet 4 requirements: a subject, an object, an action, and an intent. And of course, as you can tell from the rather creepy photo, he isn't any ordinary fellow. He's Fritz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka death camp. This is Fritz Stangl justifying himself to Gita Sereni, the grounds under which he could commit, the grounds under which he could run a camp that killed maybe getting on for 1 million people. Stangl said yes. He said, in terms of these 4 requirements, he said, we had a subject and we had an object. We had an action. The action was that we were gassing the Jews, he said. But we didn't have any intent. He said, I never intended any harm to them. He said, I had never had anything personal against the Jews. In fact, he then went into this whole disturbing thing in his interview in which he starts talking about how actually some of these Jews became close friends of his and he looked after them personally. This, of course, is the classic definition of moral license, this is exactly how these narratives get constructed in people's brains, that you do one act of good here. He had removed intention from the argument. And I think the human brain is utterly wired around this issue of intention. It is the fundamental basis of our morality, our definition of what is good or what is bad. And we have a problem with climate change and intent. Because not only does climate change not have an enemy, but it doesn't have an intention. So we can say, is there an enemy? Well, yes, it's all of us. I flew to the States to promote my book. That makes me a cause of climate change, quite a substantial one. Did I intend harm? No, I intended good. None of us intend harm. You know, even the climate change deniers don't intend harm, they're just denying climate change. So, you know, what are we doing? We're putting food on the table, we're driving our kids to school. Maybe we're having a holiday, we deserve that holiday, we've worked hard for it, we're not intending harm. And so when we say to people, you know what, no, you're the problem, what you do is the problem. We're trying to give them that intention. Of course, they push it away. They say, don't blame me. People get very angry and very defensive about it. Not surprisingly. So then when we take the information, they say, no, you should really read about this. This climate change, this is really serious. We're effectively saying, you know what, have a bite of that, and then as soon as you know that, then from that point on, you have the intention to cause harm. We're trying to infect them with intention. It's like, you know, the apple from the tree of knowledge. We're trying to say, have a big bite out of that, and from this point on, you'll really understand how utterly morally responsible and culpable you are for what's happening to the world. And are we surprised that people push it away? No, of course not. Not only do we not have a clear enemy of intent to cause harm, but actually nobody wants that intention. So people will deliberately keep themselves in a state of ignorance, deliberately avoid accepting it. Because you see, we talk a lot about the elephant in the room. It's sometimes that language, isn't it? But actually, it's the elephant we're all inside. This incident is an elephant you can all go and... Napoleon wanted to build his elephant in the Place de la Bastille with, like, you know, with ballrooms and things in it. It's the elephant that we're all inside. So who is the enemy? Because in order for us to mobilize ourselves around this, we have an innate tendency to create narratives around enemies. And this is what happens. Climate change is a narrative without an enemy. It has a gaping hole in the middle of it. We know that this is serious. Who is to blame? And there is a lot of blame going on. I met this lovely lady and I write about this in the book. It's Deborah Medina. Deborah Medina is the doyenne of the Mid-Texan Tea Party. There she is with her gun, which she assured me she always keeps down the side of her seat. I said, so, Deborah, I said, this gun, what's it for exactly? She says, well, George, she says, you never know when you might need it. I go, great. So here I am, at Deborah's invitation, going to room with, 40 Mid-Texan Tea Party people, all of which are carrying their guns, because you never know when you might need it, to argue with them about climate change. I was quite open. I was quite open about it. I said, well, this is me, but I want to hear your point of view. And boy, they had a lot of views on it. Their narrative, a narrative that they've shaped around climate change, has dealt with this missing enemy and missing intent by inserting one. It's a familiar enemy that they've had for a long time. The thing that was slightly concerning was that the enemy was actually people like me, which is not a very comfortable position to be in, facing people armed to the teeth. Invented by liberals to increase the size of government to their control and destroy our freedoms. These are kind of like the words that people use. They're very fired up about it. But I also remember feeling at the time how sad this was. That is the only way that this story could be given shape within the language and the worldview of this group was actually for it to take on this enemy formation. So they have made sense of it by inserting the missing enemy, and the enemy is the familiar enemy. But I have to say my colleagues in the environmental movement do something very, very similar. We create language and narratives which are around enemies and heroes as well. And big oil is responsible. And climate change deniers are responsible. And Rupert Murdoch is responsible. To some degree, no question. And there's somebody as George was probably saying, somebody who spent a lot of my life kind of like fighting against big companies and on these environmental issues, I'm well aware of that. But this is different. Climate change is different. Because climate change is something where in various ways we are all involved with this. In fact, measurably, right down to the last gram, we can measure our personal responsibility. And so these are attempts for us to form narratives which make sense, to mobilize people, to speak to their affective side of their brain, but I have to say also, to some degree, to my mind, they ring hollow. There's a lot of obsession in the States, for example, about the Koch brothers. Here we are, the Koch brothers who fund climate change denial. There they are, there's the Kochtopus. I have to say, in the history of this kind of iconography, you should always be wary of octopuses when they're applied to enemy stories. I have a whole string of octopus pictures. It's going to be my next dissertation. There's always an octopus behind these things, of these marauding cephalopods. So we too create the enemy narrative, and the problem with this is that then the shape and form of the issue becomes focused on the battle between the two sides. In terms of, there's other strange things too about the way that we shape and take form of this. I had an interview with Shell Oil, speaking again about moral license. Shell Oil have an obsession with what they call Goal Zero. I went into the Shell headquarters. They had a big thing up behind reception saying, Shell Oil, our responsibility is Goal Zero. Have a very, very safe visit to Shell. Report any irresponsible or unsafe behavior by your host. Goal Zero means that no accidents are permissible or necessary. I thought this was a bit strange in a headquarter building, so I went, okay. And whilst I'm watching this, the people behind the counter, they start pointing at me in this weird way, and they start saying, sir, in this kind of like weird way. They go, sir, your shoelace, sir. Your shoelace, sir. Your shoelace, you could trip and have an accident. Okay, I say, well, I like to live dangerously. And so I'm heading up the stairs in Shell. And as I'm heading up the stairs, or heading up for a conference room, I'm meeting the head of their climate change policy. They all start doing this strange thing again. They start pointing. They go, "Sir, sir." They say, "Sir, sir, the handrail, sir, the handrail. Hold the handrail, sir. You could slip. You could have an accident." I mean, it's everyone pointing. There's even the security guards. Everyone's pointing. And all the way up the sides of a handrail it says, "Hold the handrail, hold the handrail, hold the handrail." And all the steps have individually got written on them, and it says, "Warning, slippery step, slippery step." Anyway, I finally sit down with David Hone, who's the guy who's the head of their climate change policy, and he starts doing this thing as well, and he starts going, George, your pen, George. Your pen, George, it could leak. You could have an accident." I think this stuff must be so ingrained within the internal culture of Shell. And I'm thinking, yes, David, your oil reserves, you can burn them up and destroy the world. Report any dangerous behavior by your host. It's like, yes, you're destroying my planet. Here's Shell Oil. Here's Shell Oil. This is the Olympus oil field in the Mexican Gulf. Look at the language and how it creates. This is what I mean about how people create narratives around their values. The Olympus community will foster goal zero, develop people, and maximize production. This will be accomplished with a caring attitude, which is good to know, personal accountability, and process efficiency. Do you see what I mean? No harm to people or the environment. That's good to know. Engage every person, diversity, inclusion, balance, top quartile producer, no oil left behind. There's a phrase with a certain resonance. And this, I guess, is what I'm saying. But this analysis that people can turn or shape information or evidence around their own values, build their own storylines around it in order to create a moral justification for themselves is inherently what seems to keep happening with climate change. So, in the book, I explore all of this. I explore all the ways that we deal with things we don't deal with, things that we avoid, things that we create this narrative of silence. And I was just wondering, were there ways that we could do this differently? Are there ways that we could create a new and more powerful storyline on this? Well, yes, I think we can. Because just as there are areas of non-narrative, of silence, there are things that aren't said that could be said. You know, just as rather than having this storyline about how it's the enemy, about how it's this side fighting that side and they're the bad guys and we need to beat them, there's also a whole narrative of empathy, of cooperation, our immense human capacity to work together. The Immortality Project, the idea of like, what's going to be left after we die? What are we building? What's the purpose of all of this? A positive vision of how the world could be. Our sense of shared values and identity. This, after all, is you're different from me, we have different politics, we care differently, but we're all brought together about our love for things, our love for this world, or our love for our country, or our love for who we are. But maybe climate change is a test, or maybe there isn't an enemy, maybe the struggle is with ourselves in some way. But maybe the process we're going through is like a transition, it's a rite of passage, it's a coming of age, it's something which as humans we're going through in order to build something new and different. There are so many ways we could talk about climate change, but to be quite frank, we don't seem to. And that makes me think there's immense opportunities to shape this in ways that we could speak differently about it. You know, one of the greatest, most poisonous things of climate change is how it's become politically polarized, how people of left and right hold it in quite different ways. It's become the single largest mark of conservative identity now, in America certainly. It is a better predictor of identity in America, of political allegiance, than gun control or abortion or capital punishment. But people do not accept that climate change exists. I think that is tragic. There is no way we can move forward on this unless we can find a way of all coming together on it. But conservatives need stories and they need narratives around us shaped around their values, not my values. I'm not conservative and I don't share those values. I want them to have their values. And the organisation COIN and this is Adam's report here, this is one of the things we've been trying to work on. Almost on our own, incidentally. Because climate change is so locked into a way of thinking which is built on the values of a more left-leaning environmental movement that no one is thinking actually how can this take on a shape and form that speaks to people of different politics, which seems to me fundamental. This guy, Rob Sisson, is very interesting. He's the president of Conserve America, which is a Catholic, very conservative Catholic organization in the States. And he gets climate change as a revelation. And he describes it in terms of abortion. I go, wow. Climate change is the greatest single infringement on liberty after abortion. We fight for the 600,000 American babies who are poisoned while still in their mothers' wombs every year by toxins released from burning fossil fuels. Politically, I have problems with this. I do not agree with Rob with his views on this. But I also go, wow, you know what? There are ways of talking about climate change that are completely different. Stories based on completely different values which speak to different people and mobilize them in different ways. This is what we need to be hearing. And one of the people, loving talking to people who don't work on climate change, one of the people who's most influential on me was a guy called Joel Hunter. He's the head of the 10th largest church in America. He's built this church from nothing. He has 10,000 people every week come to his services. Quite extraordinary. Joel gets climate change. He says it was a personal revelation sent by God. Well, that's interesting. Well, why not? Why can't we talk about climate change as a revelation? Why do we have to assume that this is something which just comes in the form of reading a report? I said, Joel, it's very tricky territory now because we're exploring this area between the rational side of the brain and the affective side, between the emotions and belief and the scientific basis. But I said, just tell me, from your perspective as a religious organizer, what could we in the environmental movement be doing differently about this? And the answers he gave me were extraordinary and fascinating and hugely inspiring. Not necessarily his ideas, but the way that we could reconstruct things if we asked different questions. One thing he said is, you know what you environmental guys do? You just give people a leaflet, you tell them to go to a website. We build a community of belief. We bring people together, and a community within which we say it's okay to doubt it. He says, sure, you might not be certain. Sure, you might come and go. You might have doubts from week to week. You might have uncertainties. And he said, you know what? We'll hold your hand and we'll take you through that together. Well, we don't do that for climate change. We just assume that climate change is absorbed by a kind of osmosis. You put your hand on a report and it all kind of like sucks up your arm. And we know that isn't actually how human brains work. And why would Joel not know this? Because he is the latest development in 2,000 years of experimentation in how people come to terms with issues which are, let's face it, uncertain in the future and require people to make short-term sacrifices for uncertain and insecure long-term gains. As he himself would say. He says what we also do is fundamental to our faith and what we do is witnessing. When we believe in something, we share it with everyone. We share it with each other. We go out into the world. In the words of the Bible, you don't hide your light under a bushel. You go out and you light up the world. I'm thinking, very interesting. This is the difference with the idea of constructed silence. This is the idea of actually going out but it's that social cue. It's like by saying, I care about this, pay attention to this. He said it came to him as an epiphany. Epiphany fascinates me as an area of climate change. Because for everybody who gets climate change, there is some process that led them there, and that is often a process which had something which turned around, something which shifted. He understands that, and we need to understand it. And he says, but what happens is that they also generate that. There's something else that we can do. They generate that shift in attitude by saying to people, you've heard the word, come forward. They call it an altar call. This is what Billy Graham used to do in his big public outreach. You've heard it. Stand up now. Come forward. Be prepared to change your life. I go, that's very, very interesting. There's that idea of putting people on a moment of choice when they have to decide that are they with it or are they not with it, and that they're going to change. Again, we have none of this language in climate change, and I want to bring it in. Not in this form, and climate change is not a religion, it is grounded in science, but there is also a science to human cognition and our attitudes and what changes who we are and how we shape our views. Finally, forgiveness. And I think this is one of the key ones. Climate change is very much about guilt, and that is why people push it away. That's why they ignore it. He says this is extraordinary. He said, like, in religion we give people a very heavy moral load. We say you have to change the way you live, that you have a responsibility, that you have to accept a different way of being, but you also have a forgiveness. In climate change there is no language of forgiveness. You say to people, you have to accept a moral load, and you know what? You're responsible for it. But there's no room, there's no language, there's no discourse around forgiveness. I don't even know what that would look like. I just know it's a whole other area that we are scarcely talking about. Questions can come later. So, really, I guess what the book is and I realise I've been talking a bit longer than I wanted, so I'll stop now. But really what the book is exploring some of these issues and themes. They're questions. Why is things so weird? Why are responses so strange? Are there answers? Yes, there's many answers. Are there solutions? Yes, many more. And I hope sharing with you some of my enthusiasm and excitement about the possibility there may be vast new ways of talking about and thinking about this that we have scarcely explored, scarcely touched, the hope that there might be entirely new ways of engaging with this issue. And thank you very much.
Thanks very much, and thank you, George, for such a fantastic presentation. And what we're going to try to do is to have not so much a standard question and answer session, but more of a conversation, a continuing conversation amongst all of us. So you don't need to formulate a specific question. What you do need to do is not go on for longer than about 30 seconds. And George doesn't need necessarily to give you an answer, but to sort of get us talking in ways which are going to help to build on the themes which George has explored. And I'd like to abuse my chair's privilege by kicking off, challenging you on something that you said. You said that perhaps the most poisonous aspect of climate change is the political polarization that it's come to involve. And that's actually very challenging for a very large number of people in this room. I think most of us are probably on the left. Most of us probably wouldn't be here if we weren't on the left. Naomi Klein, unfortunately I couldn't make it, but very recently was in the Sheldonian preparing the ground for you and pointing out that this is a great left-wing cause. This is what progressives should be mobilizing around. It's a great defining feature in our battle against capitalism. And the obvious implicit message there is that there's an enemy, and they're the people on the right. They're the capitalists, they're the enemy. And so you're telling us something profoundly and completely at odds with that. Well, go on, off you go.
Well, thank you. No, not profoundly at odds. I completely understand and respect what she's doing. She's doing what I'm saying, which is that she's trying to create a compelling narrative out of climate change and a sense of unity and coming together with a sense of purpose. And she's doing that on the basis of the values of a group, and they're values which in many ways that I share. So I completely understand and respect that. That's why I was thrilled that she could come and talk with us. I do think, however, that when that goes to the extent of talking about as if there's this single block of conservatives as our opponent, I'm afraid I do find this problematic. I've said this to her as well. That there isn't a single block of, if we say we're on this side against them on that side, I think that we are dangerously simplifying the issue. And that we're effectively doing the same thing as the people on the right do when they doltishly say, especially in America, where they say, well, they put everyone together, the environmentalists and the left-wingers and the Obama Democrats, they're all the left. So like, your friend on the Telegraph, what's his name?
Christopher Booker.
No, Dellingpole, who calls us all watermelons, because we're green on the outside and red on the inside. So, I think we need to have language which mobilizes people around a sense of common identity, and to some extent that is marking the difference from other people. But I think we also we have to have a sense of our common identity about the fact that actually there are very important things that we share, but we all share collectively across this. And I think we should be reaching out across these boundaries as well, of saying, you know what, we're going to very strongly disagree about how to go about this, but at least we can share a common sense of purpose that it needs to be done. And that's where I feel that the debate needs to be. So, Naomi said, this is a radical cause. And for me, the most radical thing I can think of right now is to be spending my time with conservatives, trying to see if we can find some way that they can take hold of this issue in their own form. And then we can have a proper discussion. So for me, the priority is how do we have people right across society of all of these different values and different politics all saying, yes, we need action on climate change. Then we can have the debate. Yeah? And I'm also worried that the patterns we put in place now are going to are what's going to create the precedent for how we deal with it in the future. So if we set in place now patterns which are about opposition, about us versus them, about black versus white, you're either on our side or you're part of the enemy, but we're putting in place for tram lines for the way that we'll deal with this issue in the future, which will lead itself further down the argument of enemy narratives. It's your fault, that the blame will shift around, rather than a sense of shared responsibility.
Does anyone want to build on that? Can you wait for the microphone?
No problem.
One of your first slides, that juxtaposition in the Independent front cover about climate change, and then a great big advertising supplement for flights to somewhere or other. Now, the Independent didn't do that because it was stupid. There will have been, I'll bet there was probably a row in the Independent, I'm guessing, about doing that. And the advertising people won. And they said, well, do you want to carry on publishing Independent, or do you want to take this ad? End of story. They're caught in the iron grip of the logic of the system.
Yes.
And without challenging the system, we're really not going to get very far.
Yes.
Another thing that flows from that is, why is the holiday in Florida, wherever, the only good thing that a lot of people have got in their lives? How about a 2-hour working day?
And thank you. And but I don't see these arguments as being mutually exclusive. I completely agree. I don't think it has to be this. I guess what I'm saying is I don't think there has to be an us and a them. I don't think that there can be ways that people are fighting for the principle of having, of having shorter working days or social rights or equality, and other people be fighting for the concern about their sense of nationhood or their sense of culture. I think people can come at this from very different angles. I think in some ways we're all victims of the system. But I'm not answering you. I think your challenge is valid. Just a matter of interest, there's no blame here anywhere, but I wonder if everybody could put into their hands in the air if they have done a long-haul intercontinental flight in the course of last year. Okay. I'm only mentioning it. I mean, I think that it is, I guess, this key point. I'm saying it's a system, but it's a system which we're all dupes in this, and we're all forced by the system. We are all also, in some ways, participants of it. We have a mixed relationship with it, do we not?
No. I heard a voice over here who just got pipped at the post. Yeah. Was it you? Great. I'll wait for the microphone.
As I read Naomi Klein, she is focusing the opposition on a very small group. She would bring in on her side many Republicans and conservatives who are working people who are not benefiting. So it's not that she's left and right, and she makes that quite clear in many ways. And I think she's onto something, because I think, as this man over here said, we're up against what she says is a very powerful small elite.
Yes.
And that is a recurring problem which she, I think, has a good handle on.
I think you're right, and I think that there is that language which was around that about saying if we're going to change things, to change everything, you need everyone. And I entirely agree with that. I would like to see more of that language, of building across those boundaries. But you're absolutely right.
Who wants to take this further? Go on the corner.
But we can also open up new lines of conversation as well. Yeah.
I noticed the title of your book is Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. What interests me is clearly your brain and my brain and the brains of the other people around here, and presumably quite a lot of other people, aren't wired that way. Do we understand why we appear to think differently from the people you're largely talking about here?
Look, I think that's very, well, I think that, exactly. I mean, that's the challenge to the idea that we can't deal with climate change because it's an inherently difficult problem. You have to explain why there's one bunch of people who really do seem to get it, and there's another bunch who don't. And I'd say that, again, it comes down to a commonality. This is why it is our brains. It's not that our brains are wired to ignore climate change or pay attention. It's our brains are, and the wiring word I'm not very keen on. It's that our brains are set up to work in certain ways and respond in certain ways. In particular, as I said, this way that we make sense of a world in the form of these the values. We build our understanding of the world on the back of the values. I think it is certainly true that, again, going back to the points that Naomi was making, that climate change is inherently challenging to many people of a certain set of politics, just as climate change seems to fit quite well with people of my politics. The idea that built into this is a criticism of the current system and the way that we live, and that this is something which is built on industrialization of overconsumption and so on. So it's not that actually any of us are wired differently, it's that we're actually wired the same way. It's just that this issue engages differently with this process I was talking about the things that we pay attention to or the things that we disattend. Yeah? I incidentally just want to pick up on, I say this word "we" is always a very problematic word as well. I talk about this in the book, but when we talk about our brains, we've got to be very careful with this. Of course, it's shorthand for the cover, but who is this "we"? When we say this "we," is this an inclusive "we" or an exclusive "we"? But I think it is fair to say that despite all of our enormous differences, we have enormous similarities in terms of how we deal with issues, even if it brings us to very different outputs.
I saw quite a few hands in this sector. Is there a woman on this side with a question? I'd like to make sure that it's not all men. Yes, go on, Jo.
Thanks, George. I'm not deconstructing your book title, but I was just very struck by it's the "don't even think about climate change," and I think a lot of the tenor of this evening has been about "don't even feel about climate change" as well, how we're blocking off feeling about it. And I was really struck by the talking about doubt and forgiveness, because that does seem to give a space for people to sort of doubt it intellectually, but there's a space for doubt and there's a space for feeling in there. And I know that a lot of, different sorts of community groups are creating those kind of spaces. Some of it's through creativity, some of it's through carbon conversation, some of it's through creating a space where people can think, I don't know what to think, is that okay? And I'd just be curious if you'd come across any other processes from talking with people in groups that I'm really not familiar with, about how they deal with or sort of overcoming the doubt and forgiveness.
Before letting George answer that, I'd really like to open up and explore this area of doubt and forgiveness, which are the two things which fascinate me and really got me thinking, having read George's book. Is there anyone who wants to develop it a bit? Doubt and forgiveness.
I was thinking about forgiveness.
Can everyone hear, or do you, we'll get the mic over? Okay, you talk louder, go on.
I was thinking about forgiveness when you were talking about the left-right issue, because it is also, of course, self-forgiveness, isn't it? Because it's to do with us, we can be, one of the things that makes us so frozen is that, oh God, what the hell have we done? And I like the way that the transition movement talks about it, Rob Hoffman, when he says that, there's nothing, we mustn't be ashamed of, these ways. Just conceptually for a moment, that's when perhaps the new solutions, which are neither left nor right, perhaps, different forms of, lowercase capitalism, definitely not capitalism, because it's not to do with capital, because that in itself is to do with the expansion thing, but the, different forms of, innovative and generous business, should we call it, or something like that, where people can feel that they have their own solutions. That you can have a sort of bit of a muddle of different people coming through with different solutions, but perhaps not to get a little bit more chaotic.
Anyone else on the theme of forgiveness? Because I think it's a good one.
Yes, I'm happy, by the way, not to necessarily treat these as questions at all. I'm really enjoying the fact that people are contributing such strong ideas.
If all of the people with their hands up in that corner want to talk about forgiveness, I'll go to all of you very quickly in a circle. So that you've got 20 seconds each on it.
Okay. The left hand couldn't exist without the right hand. You couldn't have the left without the right, the black without the white, the light without the dark. And so I suppose what I wanted to add to what you said before was that I think Mother Teresa talked about the fact that we can't all do great acts of goodness, but we can do small acts with great love. And I suppose one way of touching that commonality in everybody is helping us all just go beyond that edge of what's actually comfortable for ourselves, be it not taking a flight or not buying that item from a shop.
Keep going around that circle. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder whether framing the problem in terms of ethics and responsibility isn't a better way than of making people afraid.
Okay.
I also think that children should be involved.
Thank you.
I've written a bit about forgiveness, and the one piece I want to talk about is that it's actually a process, it's a journey. It's not straightforward. The other thing I've been trying to do recently, not very successfully, is just to play with what it feels like to be forgiving towards people like Nigel Lawson. And it's a very interesting process.
Yes, challenging one. Yeah.
I was thinking about doubt and sort of wanting to reframe it a bit and thinking that perhaps it was often about fear. And when we're frightened, well, often it's hard to know when we're frightened because it's a very paralysing feeling. And so I think it's important, for all of us to recognise how frightening this area is when we think, if we let ourselves think about it. Because if we can at least recognise that, then we may be able to start mobilising.
And the man on the end, you wanted to say something too, so.
Yeah, well, first of all, I should acknowledge that I do think untrammeled capitalism is a problem when I'm thinking. But I was thinking about the us and them aspect and the need for an enemy and how often the enemy is a projection. The psychotherapist would say that the people we construct our enemies. And maybe as much as forgiveness for other people, we need to think about acceptance of ourselves and our own weaknesses and foibles.
Thank you. Those were fantastic, articulate responses. I'll pass it back to George.
No, I'm very happy to leave it with that. I'd like to keep hearing from people, please.
All right, now I've slightly neglected people at the back and on this side. So anyone at the back? Right at the back there, Adam. And then we'll go to the lady in the striped shirt.
You encouraged us to talk to other people about climate change, and that reminded me of the last time a stranger spoke to me about climate change out of the blue, which was a bus driver on South Uist. And I thought that was a remarkable coincidence, because South Uist is an island entirely, it's a community, it's an island off the west coast of Scotland, it's entirely owned by the community there. It was bought out 10 years ago. And one of the things they've done is invest in renewable energy, so now the island is almost entirely powered by renewables. And I thought, surely it's not a coincidence that the one place I've ever been where someone has spoken to me about climate change out of the blue is the one place that's they've seen a real benefit from renewable energy in their daily lives. And I wondered if, when you talk about how we are hardwired not to think about these things, what that really is about is not that we're hardwired as we are, but that the world as it is makes us hardwired not to think about these things. And if, in fact, if we lived in a world where we saw these advantages all the time, and where we were stronger communities who worked together better, we'd be better able to engage with these issues.
And go in there.
This is more on forgiveness. Organisations that are involved with countries that are at war with each other tend to stay away from the word forgiveness. They tend to use the word reconciliation instead. And I just wonder whether that's more within people's reach, and that perhaps we should be thinking more in terms of not being judgmental rather than the big ask of suggesting that people forgive, which for a lot of people would be a big ask. Yeah.
And because we're short of time, I'm going to try to get in one or two from this block as well. I know there are quite a few hands. You and then you, if you don't mind. Wait for the microphone, please. Otherwise we won't hear.
Is it on? I think we have to be very careful about blame
and setting responsibility onto other people who are forming global warming, because that then becomes we and them, and then the barriers don't allow any progress at all.
Thank you. Actually, might as well go into the corner as it's closest, and then the lady in the red after that.
Hi, George. You were talking about constructing new narratives, and I wondered what you thought were the roles, or how big a role, given that we spend so much of our leisure time watching television or reading books, what sort of role you consider that art and literature ought to have, or is having, possibly, in constructing these new narratives?
Okay, and just go to the lady in the red. Then I think, George, we'll have to end the comments there and pass back to you to finish off. I'm afraid we're rather short of time. Sorry about that.
So one of the fundamental things that I felt in your talk that sort of was rubbing each other was this idea of uncertainty and doubt, and then proximity. And I think when you were talking to the lady in New Jersey in Seabreeze, I think that, maybe Hurricane Sandy had something to do with climate change. But I think, if one could see climate change and the things that happen around us as more proximate and but less doubtful somehow, I think that's where I see a real challenge also for people who believe, quotes unquote, in climate change. I think it's a struggle to see the proximity there too.
George, we've got a couple of minutes now to finish off.
That's going back to Olga. Hello. When I'm a bit booming here. The book for me is really one of exploring questions, and I think it's the nature of the way that I think about things that questions often produce more questions. And I think that what I hope is, and what I hope it will do for people, is that it will create some challenges and it will create some more questions. I have to say, the thing I'm constantly struck with this issue is that it does not produce neat answers. But therefore, the key question, which is there something extremely complex about the way we respond to this, is I think self-evident, that there is. And that therefore a simple answer that says, well, because we're wired this way, or because it's the political system which produces this, or because it's one thing or another, it's going to be a lot more complex than that. I think, however, that if we can disentangle some of the causes of what's producing it, then at least we can be starting to come up with the right answers. I said that the brain thinks in terms of metaphor, and it's the natural tendency of the way that we think, but we take the metaphor from our previous struggles and we apply it to this, as if this is an issue which is like one that we've faced before. It's not. In the book, I use the language of tame problems and wicked problems. Wicked problems. This is language which was created around decision making, in particular around planning. Wicked problems are ones which become defined by the kind of solutions and the way you think about them. Tame problems are very straightforward. They're linear. This causes this, and it can be solved in this way. And even very difficult problems can nonetheless be tamed. Wicked problems, on the other hand, are ones where the way that you come to think about it and the kind of solutions you come with answering it actually reverse back and shape the problem itself. So in other words, the problem becomes the shape and form that you turn it into. Climate change is, without question, if it is a perfect problem, it is a perfectly wicked problem. That is to say that if we try and apply a simple way of thinking about it, we actually end up with something which is false in its simplicity. And I'm afraid sometimes accepting complexity does not produce nice, clear answers. But it's like saying there are going to be, the solutions to climate change are going to come from looking at it from multiple different perspectives at the same time. That is why in this particular case I think that there's a lot of value to be said for having many different people with different values and different worldviews forming their own views of it and shaping it. In terms of you've made, yes, that does include having art and artists and people giving it different manifestations, because that's also going to be what gives it a shape and form, which helps us to understand its complexity. It is going to be what you were saying up there, the fellow at the back of the room was saying about how actually in communities which have been given a sense of ownership of energy, they have created something which speaks to their own values. Because that is also something which has got its own identity. There was another, this is what comes with scribbling things on the back of your hand when you're tired. Okay. I want to say that the aim with the book was to start a discussion and start a debate. And I think, certainly, thank you very much for your contributions. I think I've hoped that I've shown that we can do that. This is a time for, I think this is a time for intense debate, and this should be a time when multiple different points of view can all be welcome because they can all help us move forward. And thank you.